The calm broke in 1972, not with an attack, not with proof, but with a decision. A patrol officer driving along Riverside Drive late at night noticed movement ahead near the road. Low, erratic, too large to be a rabbit, too upright to be anything that belonged there. He slowed, headlights cutting through the dark, and saw a shape crossing from the riverbank toward the trees. This one did not pause to observe. It moved quickly, awkwardly, its body rising and falling as if unaccustomed to land. The officer later said it appeared injured or distressed, its gait uneven, one arm hanging differently than the other. He described its skin as leathery, mottled, reflecting light in dull patches rather than fur or scales. When it turned its head, the officer saw its face. That moment, brief and unrepeatable, ended the waiting. He fired. The shot echoed across the river and into the trees. The creature collapsed near the roadside, then slid partially down the embankment toward the water. When the officer approached, weapon drawn, he saw what looked unmistakably like a large, tailless reptile or amphibian, greenish-gray, thick-bodied, with a face flattened in a way that suggested something more than animal but less than human. Then it moved again. With a sudden burst of motion, the body twisted free and disappeared into the river. The water swallowed it whole, leaving nothing but ripples and a smell that the officer later described as mud and something coppery. No blood was recovered, no body. No follow-up search found anything unusual beyond disturbed grass and tire marks. By morning, the story had already begun to change. Officially, the officer amended his report. He claimed the creature was likely an iguana, possibly an escaped pet, mistaken in poor lighting. The shot, he said, may have grazed it or missed entirely. Iguanas, after all, can be bipedal. Briefly, they can appear strange under headlights. That explanation traveled faster than the original account. Newspapers seized it gratefully. Skeptics embraced it as closure. The Loveland Frog was reduced overnight from unknown entity to misunderstanding, a punchline tied up neatly with scales and logic. But something subtle shifted, because the explanation didn't explain why an iguana would be in Ohio in winter. It didn't explain the posture. It didn't explain the way it entered the water like something accustomed to depth rather than drowning. And it didn't explain why the officer changed his story. Among locals, the shooting rewrote the legend rather than ending it. Before, the Loveland Frog was an observer, a presence glimpsed and gone. After the shot, it became something that could be harmed, something that had been wounded or provoked. Sightings dropped sharply in the months that followed. The river returned to something closer to normal. People relaxed, cautiously, telling themselves the mystery had resolved itself. But in quiet conversations, a different narrative formed. That the thing had learned, that it had tested how far it could be seen without consequence, and discovered the limit. That night had drawn a line it hadn't known existed, and if it withdrew after being shot, it wasn't because it was gone, it was because it now understood the rules. The Loveland Frog had stopped revealing itself, not vanished, just adjusted. The years that followed the shooting were quieter but not empty. The Loveland Frog no longer appeared in the open way it once had. There were no figures lingering on riverbanks, no silhouettes framed in headlights. What replaced them were absences, gaps in expected behavior that were harder to point to and easier to ignore. People near the river spoke about the feel of nights changing. Not colder, not darker, just watchful in a subtler way. Fishermen returned to their spots but noticed how often lines came back slack, as if something had brushed them without biting. Nets set overnight were found tangled in unfamiliar ways, knots tightened rather than broken, as though handled deliberately. Footprints along muddy banks appeared and vanished without leading anywhere, wide impressions that suggested wade, yet showed no clear toe pattern that could be matched to known animals. When challenged, witnesses hesitated. They had already seen what happened to the story once. The iguana explanation had taught the town a lesson, speaking plainly only invited correction. So details softened, became conditional. Probably nothing. Could have been raccoons. River does strange things. But not everyone backed away. A handful of locals began keeping informal records, dates, weather, river height, moon phases. Nothing obsessive, nothing dramatic, just notes. They noticed that disturbances still clustered around the same bends and bridges, the same shadowed stretches avoided by dogs years earlier. And they noticed something else. The river itself seemed to be doing the approaching now. On nights after heavy rain, water levels rose higher than expected, flooding low ground without precedent. Debris washed up in strange arrangements, branches stacked, stones gathered in shallow depressions, objects caught and left where current should have carried them onward. Once, a child's missing shoe was found placed upright at the base of a bridge pillar, dry despite the wet surroundings. Authorities dismissed it as coincidence, but coincidences don't repeat cleanly. One retired officer, not involved in the 1972 incident, admitted years later that calls from the area never stopped entirely. They just changed tone. Less urgency, more uncertainty. People reporting something off rather than something seen. The idea of an apology began to circulate quietly, not a spoken one, not an admission of wrongdoing, but a behavioral one, the kind animals make when they retreat rather than retaliate, as if whatever lived near the river had learned that being visible led to pain and that invisibility was safer. That interpretation disturbed some people more than the original sightings. If the Loveland Frog could learn restraint, could alter its behavior in response to human violence, then it wasn't a random animal. It was something capable of adaptation, of memory, and memory implies time. By the late 1980s, the legend was mostly treated as a relic. Kids heard it at sleepovers, teenagers joked about it near the bridge, adults referenced it with nostalgia, as if talking about a local ghost that had outgrown its haunting. But among those who still lived closer to the river, one rule remained unspoken but widely followed. If something feels wrong near the water, you leave. You don't investigate. You don't call out. You don't try to see. Because the Loveland Frog no longer announced itself. That made it harder, not easier, to believe it was gone. Every legend reaches a point where it's supposed to fade. For Loveland, that point came when the town began to change. New roads cut closer to the river. Old houses were torn down and replaced with developments that used clean lines and bright lights, as if illumination alone could erase whatever lingered beneath. The riverbanks were reinforced in places, straightened where they once bent naturally, treated less like a living thing and more like a problem to be managed. With that came a new generation. They grew up hearing about the Loveland Frog the way people hear about haunted houses, something entertaining, something exaggerated, something adults half smiled about while insisting it wasn't real. Internet forums flattened the story further, breaking it into bullet points and theories until it lost texture, lost fear. But stories don't need belief to survive. They need witnesses. In the early 1990s, a pair of teenagers cutting through a wooded shortcut near the river reported seeing something move parallel to them just inside the tree line. Not chasing, not hiding, matching pace. When they stopped, it stopped. When they turned suddenly, it was gone. No retreating sound, no snapped branches. They laughed about it afterward, nervous laughter, the kind that doesn't last. A maintenance worker inspecting drainage culverts beneath a bridge later described finding hand-like impressions pressed into dried mud along the interior wall. The spacing was wrong for raccoons. The angle suggested fingers, not claws. When he reported it, the marks were washed away before anyone else arrived. In another case, a jogger noticed ripples forming against the current in a shallow section of the river at dusk. Whatever caused them stayed just below the surface, tracking her movement until she left the path and climbed toward the road. Only then did the water smooth out again. None of these stories spread far. They were too small, too incomplete, no photos, no proof, no dramatic conclusion. Each one ended the same way, with someone deciding it wasn't worth making a fuss. That quiet dismissal became the new pattern, and yet something subtle returned to the old reports. The posture. Witnesses who described movement near the river increasingly mentioned the same detail, a sense of being regarded from a lower height, as if something crouched just out of view, watching, not hiding, waiting for people to move on before reclaiming the space. The frog, if it was still appropriate to call it that, had become more careful, not less present. Some folklorists argue that legends evolve because communities need them too, that they reflect fears of pollution, of change, of the unknown living alongside progress, that the Loveland Frog was simply a vessel for unease about the river itself. But that explanation falters when unease has direction. The river did not feel hostile everywhere, only in places where the sightings had always clustered, only where shadow met water and sound carried poorly, only where the land still remembered being older than the town. By the end of the decade, the Loveland Frog was rarely spoken of aloud, not because it had been disproven, but because it had become awkward, too persistent to laugh off, too elusive to confirm. The story hadn't died, it had learned to survive without attention, and that raised an unsettling possibility. If the Loveland Frog no longer needed belief to exist, then whatever people had been seeing all those years might never have depended on it in the first place. It had been there before the story, and it would be there after the last person stopped telling it. By the time the new century arrived, the Loveland Frog had been stripped off its edges. Online retellings blurred it into a joke, a mascot, a cartoon amphibian with a cigarette and a grin. Paranormal shows condensed decades into minutes, skipping over contradictions, smoothing out discomfort. The creature was either a hoax, a drunk officer's mistake, or an iguana with ambitions. But the problem with simplifying a thing is that you lose the parts that don't fit, and those are usually the parts that matter. People who lived close to the river continued to report details that refused to line up with any clean explanation. Not dramatic encounters, not sightings meant for cameras, just moments that didn't resolve. A woman walking her dog at dawn felt the leash go slack without resistance, as if the dog had simply stopped moving. When she turned, the animal was standing rigid, staring toward the water, ears flat, refusing to advance or retreat. After several seconds, the dog whined and pulled away on its own, never looking back. There was nothing visible in the reeds. A kayaker paddling downstream at dusk heard splashing behind him that didn't match his rhythm. When he stopped, the sound stopped. When he resumed, it returned, always just far enough back to avoid reflection in the water's surface. He exited the river early, embarrassed by his own fear. A city worker clearing brush near an old culvert found sections of vegetation pressed flat in overlapping arcs, as if something had passed through repeatedly at a consistent height, not dragged, not trampled, guided. Each incident on its own meant nothing. Together they suggested something that refused to resolve into a single form. Descriptions of the Loveland Frog had always been inconsistent, sometimes reptilian, sometimes amphibian, sometimes disturbingly humanoid. In early decades, witnesses struggled to describe its face. Now they struggled to describe its absence. It was no longer seen clearly. It was inferred. The presence was felt through reaction, animals freezing, water responding, people sensing that their movement was being mirrored or measured, as if the creator had learned that the less it revealed, the longer it could remain. That raised a quiet but uncomfortable question among those who studied regional folklore. What if the Loveland Frog had never been one fixed thing? What if it was a role rather than a species, a shape taken when conditions allowed it, abandoned when they didn't? A river adopted intelligence that appeared only long enough to test its environment before retreating again. That theory explained the contradictions, the changes over time, the way each generation described something slightly different while insisting on the same feeling. The river itself had changed, polluted, redirected, constrained. So had the thing associated with it. If that was true, then the Loveland Frog was not fading. It was refining. And refinement implies intention. By now, the sightings had become almost impossible to report without sounding foolish. No one wanted to be the person claiming they felt observed by water. So most people kept quiet, telling themselves that discomfort was subjective, that fear created patterns where none existed. But silence doesn't erase patterns, it only hides them. And along the Little Miami River, in the places where sound still swallowed itself and light bent oddly at dusk, something continued to leave just enough trace to remind the attentive that ambiguity was not the same as absence. The Loveland Frog had become harder to define, which meant it was also harder to dismiss, and perhaps harder to confront. Long after the witnesses stopped talking, the locations themselves continued to behave strangely. That was the detail most people missed. Land doesn't forget the way people do. Along the Little Miami River, certain stretches resisted change no matter how much effort was put into them. Fences installed near the banks warped faster than expected. Posts leaned without clear cause. Vegetation grew unevenly, thick in some places, stunted in others, forming natural corridors that seemed to guide movement rather than block it. Surveyors blamed soil inconsistency. Engineers blamed water pressure. Everyone had a reasonable answer, but those answers never explained why animals avoided the same narrow zones year after year. Deer tracks split and rejoined around empty spaces. Birds nested elsewhere. Even insects seemed sparse in certain shaded pockets, as though the ground itself discouraged habitation. Dogs on leashes pulled hard to avoid those areas, regardless of breed or training. People noticed. They just didn't connect it to the story anymore. The Loveland Frog had become disconnected from the environment in public memory, reduced to a headline creature, but privately. Among longtime residents, a different understanding persisted. The river bends where it wants to, and something else bends with it. One amateur historian, retired, meticulous, patient, began mapping reports from the 1950s onward. Not just sightings, but odd behaviors, sudden silences, equipment failures, animals reacting to empty space. When layered together, the map revealed clusters so tight they could not be coincidence. The same bends, the same culverts, the same low-lying ground that flooded even in dry seasons. The historian never published his findings. He shared them quietly, one conversation at a time. He didn't want attention. Attention, he believed, was what caused things to shift. He proposed a restrained idea that whatever people had labeled the Loveland Frog was not moving through the area. It was anchored, bound to specific conditions: water depth, temperature, cover, human absence. It did not roam, it waited. When conditions aligned, it surfaced just enough to assess its surroundings, and when they didn't, it withdrew completely. That would explain the gaps, the decades of near silence, the way sightings flared briefly and then vanished again. The creature wasn't gone. It was dormant. Occasionally, construction crews unknowingly disturbed those old zones. Each time, something small happened. Tools misplaced, sudden unease, a worker quitting after a single shift, unable to articulate why. The river swelling without forecast. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable, just enough resistance to slow progress. The idea that the land itself was enforcing boundaries unsettled people more than any monster description ever had. You could shoot a creature, you could deny it, you could laugh it away, but you couldn't argue with a place that refused cooperation. In quiet moments, standing near the river at dusk, some residents described the sensation of being out of step, as though they were moving slightly ahead of the present moment or slightly behind it. Sound arrived late, movement felt observed after the fact. That sensation passed quickly. Most people never experienced it twice. Those who did stopped going back. By the early 2000s, no one seriously hunted the Loveland Frog anymore. There were no expeditions, no baited cameras, no attempts at proof. The idea of provoking whatever lingered there felt instinctively wrong, as if something had already learned the limits of interaction, and as if it was content to let humans forget so long as they stayed where they belonged. The Loveland Frog had receded fully into environment, no longer a figure to confront, no longer even a story to argue about. It had become a condition, and conditions don't announce themselves. They persist quietly, waiting for the moment when someone unknowingly recreates the circumstances that first allowed them to be noticed at all. There is no ending to the Loveland Frog that feels complete. Nobody was ever recovered. No final sighting closed the record. No confession tied everything together and let the story rest. Instead, the legend thinned out the way fog does, pulling back without ever truly leaving. That absence became its final shape. In recent years, interest in the Loveland Frog has returned in small, almost accidental ways, not through investigations or documentaries, but through casual rediscovery. Someone scrolling late at night, someone walking the river and remembering a story they once dismissed. What they find now is not fear, it's unease. The place associated with the sightings remains subtly resistant to attention. Cameras glitch, audio recordings flatten. People report feeling foolish for even trying to document the area, as though the impulse itself evaporates once they arrive. The river flows on, indifferent but not empty, and that is the quiet conclusion the story offers. Whatever people once glimpsed was never meant to be resolved. It did not escalate into confrontation because confrontation was never the point. The Loveland Frog was not a threat in the traditional sense. It was a reminder that there are spaces where definition fails, where something can exist without clarity, without consent, without the need to be acknowledged. The river did not create the creature, nor did belief sustain it. It simply allowed it. Those who walk the Little Miami River at night still describe moments of misalignment, footsteps echoing oddly, shadows moving out of sync, the feeling that the water is aware of their presence without reacting to it. They leave soon after, not because they saw anything, but because the river does not correct them. It does not reassure them that nothing is there. And in folklore, that may be the most honest ending possible. The Loveland Frog remains exactly where it has always been, not as a figure standing on the road, not as a creature waiting to be seen, but as a boundary between what is observed and what simply continues. Unconcerned with witnesses, uninterested in proof, patient enough to outlast every version of the story told about it.